in history books, it's kind of like they just brought it to him on a platter, got him down on a knee, and begged him, please, Mr. Churchill, save us.
Exactly. Well, I think part of that is because Churchill is such a huge historical figure that he's basically swept everybody else off the stage historically.
He's almost a minor character in this book.
I wouldn't say he's a minor character.
No, but
he's off to the side to some extent, yes. His presence still looms very large in the book because it's all leading up to his becoming prime minister. But yes, it focuses on this other group of men who helped bring him, to power. But I think you're absolutely right. I think most people think of, if they think of the phoning war at all, it's a time of waiting for the real war to start, when in fact there was a lot going on, and it could have gone either way for England. I mean, England could easily have been defeated, I think, or at least negotiated for peace with Hitler if Churchill hadn't become prime minister.
He also had a curious idea of loyalty, because he would change parties if there was a strong issue, but once he gave his personal loyalty, he seemed unwilling to let that go.
Churchill was a really complex guy. He is, I think most people consider him a rebel because of what you just talked about, because of his changing parties, because he spoke out against appeasement early on against his own prime minister. But I think basically deep down he was a very conservative man, and he was extremely loyal. He considered loyalty to be just ultra important, which is very much like the British establishment. And he was loyal to Neville Chamberlain throughout the phoning war. He was in Neville Chamberlain's cabinet, and he refused to have anything to do with any plot to bring Chamberlain down, and made it very clear that he wasn't going to take part in any plot. He was also, you've got to remember that he was involved in actually running the war as First Lord of the Admiralty. He had a big role, and that's what he really wanted to do. So his energies were occupied by doing that. I'm sure in the back of his mind, or even in the front of his mind, he was thinking, if Chamberlain falls, I may be the prime minister. But as far as I can tell, and as far as all the research I did, there's no indication that he did anything overt to help the rebels do what they did.
Two of the guys really stood out.
Amory
and
Ronald Cartland.
Cartland and Amory, yeah. Those two guys I thought were the most interesting, because they're, for one thing,
I'm glad you did, because they're the most interesting to me too.
Well, I mean, other names that were, Lord Halifax is in there, but he's, on Chamberlain's side. Anthony Eden is there. But these guys who I'd never heard of were really nobody, who had this brief time of greatness themselves to further someone else's greatness.
Right, yeah. I think one of the things that is wonderful about this whole period and these people is it shows that a group of men who had very little power and influence, as you said, stood up for what they believed, and in doing that they changed the course of history. And it was certainly true of Cartland and Amory. I mean, Cartland was a young Tory who had great political ambition. He wanted to be prime minister himself someday. But he was also fearless. He spoke his mind, and regardless of the consequences, and he was very much against appeasement. And in a debate in the House of Commons the month before war broke out in August 1939, he got up and called Neville Chamberlain a dictator to his face. I mean, this is the prime minister of his party, the leader of his party. And he predicted that within a very short time that young men like himself were going to fight and they were going to die. And Chamberlain was furious. He called Cartland a traitor. He tried to get him thrown out of the House of Commons. He did his best. And in the end, the sad thing is that Cartland did die. That Cartland was a member of the Territorial Army. He was an officer in the Territorial Army, and he was in France when the Germans invaded France and the Low Countries, and he was killed trying to lead his men to Dunkirk. Leo Amory was a man who had been a close friend and supporter of Neville Chamberlain's for most of his career, and had been a rival of Winston Churchill's. They had known each other since they were in school at Harrow. But he had been a close supporter of Chamberlain's until the invasion of Austria, the Anschluss in Austria in 1937, and then he became part of the anti-appeasement force and took over leadership of the rebels during the phony war. He decided that Chamberlain had to go and that he was going to try to be the one to make the speech that would make that happen. And he got up, and this is a man who's known as a stupefyingly boring speaker, and he got up and gave a scathing denunciation of Chamberlain. And he ended it with a quotation from Oliver Cromwell, which basically said, he got up and he was looking at his friends on the front bench, the cabinet ministers and Chamberlain, and he said, "Depart, I say, and let us have done with you." These are the words of Oliver Cromwell. And then he added, his last line was, "In the name of God, go." Well, it just stunned the house, that kind of thing. I mean, you don't say that kind of thing.
The book is Troublesome Young Men, the rebels who brought Churchill to power and helped save England. I'm speaking with the author, Lynne Olson, and Troublesome Young Men, published by Bond Street Books, distributed in Canada by Random House.